Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today I'm welcoming Reverend Dr. Chow to the show. Sean is the Associate for 1001 New Worshiping Communities for Training and Leadership Cohorts for the Presbyterian Church, PCUSA. He resources and consults with regional denominational bodies, churches, and church plants as they launch new creative expressions of church. He is a graduate of Azusa Pacific University with a Master of Divinity from San Francisco Theological Seminary and a Doctor of Ministry at New York Theological Seminary. The author of Rediscovering Vitality, which we'll be talking about here shortly, Sean has an inner desire to be part of a God-driven movement that impacts the world for God's glory. His aim is to prepare, equip, and sustain leaders to do the work in which God calls them. He is a frequent speaker to churches, committees, gatherings, and conferences. Sean and his family live in Southern California, where he can be found at a local tennis court, having reconnected to an old passion. All right, welcome to the show, Sean Chow. What else would you like our listeners to know about you?
Oh, for me, it's just kind of what you read in my bio is plenty. But I love to be with churches and to talk with leaders and see what they're experiencing. That's just what I love to do these days.
Great. Talk about, if you would, your journey of faith, how that, what that looked like initially and what that looks like today.
Well, I think my faith, like a lot of different people, was kind of developed over a long period of time. So I didn't go to church or anything like that until I was in junior high and high school, and I really got exposed to kind of the Christian faith through youth pastors. In the 80s, youth ministry was just a huge thing, as opposed to it is a lot now. And so I spent a lot of time, and I remember like my faith journey really what was in service to other people. I remember I came to faith in a little village outside of Mexicali, Mexico, during a missions trip. That I thought we were just going to go to Mexico for the summer. I thought my parents were the coolest things ever, letting me go with a whole bunch of high schoolers to Mexico for a mission trip. And it was there just in the middle of this rural village, which I encountered Jesus, and I encountered what unconditional love was, and kind of gave me that whole sense of meaning. And it kind of grew through that, and the nurturing of the small group that I was a part of for many different years. And then kind of my faith has really grown by God placing different people in my life to kind of move me to that next place in my life, to challenge me to those next thoughts or wherever God was kind of leading me. But a lot of it's been developed by just God putting different people in my head, not in my head, but into my heart and into my life, that kind of nurtured me and walked with me through different spaces.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. What are some spiritual practices that you've developed or are meaningful for you?
I think like a spiritual practice, we always have those different people that you aspire to be. Like,
Right.
There's this lady that used to be at that church that I used to serve as the youth director for, that she's like, oh, she's getting up to pray. We're going to be here for like 15 minutes. But she exuded Jesus. You know, those different people that you're like, how do you just exude Jesus? And when you walk in the door, you feel Jesus and all these different things. And I've always longed to be those different people, whether it's it was that Sylvia who exuded Jesus, or the Jay Licata that's in my life that you're like, I know he was praying for me constantly. And so, and I've always tried, and I think that's the problem with sometimes of us, is that we're always trying to measure ourselves to those people that we idolize in our faith walk. And I realized, it took me a long time, that I'm never going to be Sylvia, or I'm never going to be Jay. I have to figure out what this faith walk looks like for me as Sean, as a person of faith. And it might not be like the friends that I have. They're like, we wake up every morning and we read the Bible in Greek and we journal for 2 hours. I'm like, that is so not me. But for me, it's understanding the Bible, reading through it, really sitting and letting it be But I think that for me, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later on, is that whole idea that that our faith is like we internalize it, we consume it, whether it's a Bible study or whatever it is. Don't mind my dog there. Um, but we internalize it, but we don't go and do and to be. And I think that's the important part. That's my spiritual practices. How do I live out the faith that I've internalized? We can sit there and read the Bible about different things that are going on, but how do we go and do? How do we live it out? Because oftentimes we have a consumer mentality in churches. It's like, hey, if they're not feeding us, if they're not giving us what we need, I need to go somewhere that I can. And it's all about a me perspective as opposed to how do I live out God's word that's been portrayed to me. And I think that's the important spiritual practice in my life. It isn't, because I would love to be those people getting up and reading in Greek and stuff like that. I'm like, oh, that was so amazing. But I realized that's not my personality. But how do we find the spiritual practice that works for us? And I believe it's like reflecting on the verses that God's really put in my life, and then how do I live them out? And so that whole idea of living out God's word is that real spiritual practice that resonates in my life.
Yeah, I like that. Thanks for sharing that. Well, let's talk about your book, Rediscovering Vitality, a handbook for church visioning and missioning, struggling with that word, which many churches are struggling with the concept.
Yeah.
Again, Rediscovering Vitality, a handbook for church visioning and missioning. And first tell our listeners kind of about what inspired the book.
Well, a lot of it was I was going through my doctorate at the process, like a few years back. I was going through my doctorate and really, I was like, when you're going back for your doctorate ministry, I'm like, some people like to be challenged. I'm like, oh, cool. Another degree would be really cool because, why not another degree? And then I was like, I was planning on playing it safe through that whole Cornerstone project, that practical end. It's like, I'll just redo something that we've already done with my previous job. Maybe we'll create a training manual or whatnot. But Dr. Tina Blair, who was my faculty advisor and the head of the doctorate program, goes, because we just entered COVID, like just as this was going on. She goes to us and goes, you're at a place where you can impact the church in remarkable ways. Mm-hmm. She's all swing for the fences at these times as opposed to playing it safe. Because she's like, the church is entering a new place. And oftentimes we don't have the time or the space or even the bandwidth to really wrestle with this. So she's like, go swing for the fences, make a difference. What you do, make it a gift to the church. And so I remember reading an article which was kind of really talking about how this pandemic is really going to shift the church. So it was like early 2020 where we're like, how does this whole thing work? The church, we were expecting as the church to kind of just shut down for a little while and come back and exactly be the same. But as longer it went, it's not just like me or something like that, began to see something's different about this. And I think that's what kind of really inspired the book was like, hey, churches we're having to shut everything down. I remember the church that I sit in the back of because I'm on the road so often. And so when I go to church with my family, I have to sit in the back because you don't get to sit in the back as a pastor very often. Right. So I think it's really cool. But like as in all churches, it had to figure out what they thought was essential. Mm-hmm. What is essential for their church? And it kind of got whittled down. It's like, hey, they found that community was important. And so community for them was, hey, we need to figure out how to come together in Zoom, or how do we come together? But also the sacraments were important. How do we do communion together? We do it every month, and we just kind of like, okay, whatever. Every month it's another thing to do. But then we realized that it was essential to the church, or this particular church, was that we need to come together and do communion somehow. And so this whole idea of finding out what was essentials, everything else just kind of threw apart. The potluck dinners, the small groups, some of these other things that we do as churches, was not essential for us. That each church had to figure out what was essential to keep it going. For some, it wasn't like you couldn't do Zoom because you just didn't have the capabilities to do Zoom. So they met in parks or whatever it is, but we whittled down who we were as a church as essential. And so as we reemerge from this pandemic, we're having to say, okay, we will ourselves down. Are we wanting to go back to what we were before? Is that what God called us to be, was what we were before? Or is there a new future out there? And what is that possibility of what God's calling this particular church, Assemblies of God, Lutherans, Methodists, whatever it is? What is God calling this particular church to be, impact its community? Because as we know, the communities have vastly changed in the last couple of years. That it isn't just people moving, but the way people's lives are drastically different.
Yeah. So kind of on this topic of COVID, you had a couple points in the book that I thought were really interesting. One was you made the comparison of COVID as an ice age versus a blizzard. So I don't know if you want to kind of talk through that and then talk through the metaphor there.
Yeah, so a lot of this metaphor came from Andy Crouch, who early in, I think, March 2020, wrote an article about this. And I was just amazed by this article, since it was under a month into COVID, and he starts making these comparisons, but he goes a different direction than kind of where I kind of took it. But you think of, so I'm a Southern California boy. I kind of grew up, went to college here at Azusa Pacific, and I've lived on the coast here in just by Santa Barbara for 20 some odd years. But one of my first jobs was to of an ordained minister was just across the bridge from Philadelphia in New Jersey. And I remember stepping into the doors one of the first days at that church, and an old gentleman from the church comes to me and hands me a snow shovel. He's like, Sean, if you're going to survive on the East Coast, you have to learn how to shovel snow. He's like, I'm not going to teach you how to do it, but you're going to need to know how to do it, because things are different here. You're not in California anymore. And I was like, okay. And then so what I've learned in being on the East Coast is, hey, a blizzard comes. The snow comes, the squalls come, whatever it comes, you hunker down in your house. And then after a little while, it might be a day, it might be a couple days or whatever, the snow plows come, the salt comes, and then the roads are plowed, and everything kind of gets back to normal. That everything was simply the way it was prior to the pandemic. And then we as church people kind of expected this whole same kind of theory to apply to us as we were going through COVID. That we're like, all our governors were saying, hey, a 2-week shelter in place, COVID will pass us by, kind of like the angel of death in the Old Testament. Yeah. We're like, yeah, okay, everything's going to be back and fine. And 2 weeks later, there were people wanting to worship in choirs again. They wanted to be together. Everything wanted to return to normal, thinking that we simply went through a blizzard. But what in fact happened is that we went through an ice age. And the ice age was more than that one occurred 2 weeks, but we've experienced over the last couple of years. In that the ice age is this huge glacier that's coming down, and as it's receding, radically reshapes the landscape that we're in. The lands where the rivers used to be are in different ways, where animals used to be able to find animals, and maybe they don't live in there anymore because the trees or the roots or the weeds that they used to eat off of are now in different places. Everything has changed, and I think we've seen that over the last couple of years during COVID. That's a radical reshaping of the context of the church. Not necessarily the church, but also the world. And we talk about the social inequities that are going on. Like in California right now, they were celebrating today on the news this morning that it was a $6.58 a gallon for gas. That it dropped 2 cents in the last couple of days. They're like, woohoo! Yeah. But what happened to those people that were making it paycheck to paycheck in February of 2020? Yeah. That when gas was $2.73 a gallon, and now we're paying $6.58 a gallon. Yeah. What happened to people that are on the edge of life then, as opposed to now? We've seen the rise in social inequities that are going on. The Asian hate that's going on, the racism that we see is going on. There's so much that is going on that has happened, really magnified during these last couple of years. That do we simply sweep that under the rug, or how does the church actively engage in this new world, this new context? The question now that I hear oftentimes is, for all the churches that have gone online, hey, people aren't necessarily coming back, but if you're in Denver and you have people showing up from Philadelphia or Minnesota or Taiwan or wherever it might be,
Mm-hmm.
How do we even talk about membership anymore? It's
Right.
not that you're in driving distance to you and me, to each
Yeah.
other anymore, but the way we connect with each other is vastly different. So there's so many different intangibles that are going on in our life, in our world, in our church context, that we need to kind of really rethink of who and what we are. That it's not just simply we're going to rewind in a couple of weeks and suddenly it's going to be exactly like it was prior to the pandemic. But things have drastically changed, and the church doesn't recognize that because
Yeah.
we simply want to go back to where we were comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah, I think certainly I'll confess when I was leading a church back in March of 2020, that was my biggest thing is like, oh, we're going to take a couple of weeks off. We'll be back for Easter. But I
Yeah.
kind of lamented, I feel like, and I have lamented from my perception, at least perspective, I don't think there's been enough change, I think, or enough acknowledgement of what's changed and a desire to reevaluate, just from an evangelical source of just seeing some data the source had collected, that even from last year, attendance is down 30%. So I mean, it's
Yeah.
significant change that churches are seeing. So here's maybe a follow-up question related to COVID and change. What do you think changes? What do you think changes from COVID are temporary? What changes are permanent? And maybe what should be, similarly, what should be temporary? What should be permanent? What are your thoughts there?
Well, something like some of the changes that I think are temporary is I think this idea that we can be in community as a church through distance. Like while I can do this, but we are relational people. I think we need to refigure out what this relationship is. Even though I have nothing wrong with saying, "Hey, I'm connecting from here or there or whatever," we're a relationship as a body of Christ. We need to figure out how to do it, how to be vulnerable with one another. How can I uplift each other? Saying, "Hey, Lauren, how can I be there for you?" Even though the relationships can be built online. I think this idea that we're going to be able to do things hybridly easily. I think everyone thinks, okay, just to pass off whatever. My mother-in-law loves to watch her service online, so she's like, I feel more comfortable. I don't have to get up, get myself ready, or whatnot. But this whole idea of that we can get along in our lives without relationships with one another. I don't know how it's done. I'm not bashing, like saying,
Right.
hey, hybrid can't be done. But what is important is our relationship. Though somebody supporting me in my life. Who am I being? Creating genuine, authentic relationships online is hard. It's hard to pour out my life and my soul to you that I'm not in that place with. When we're done with the meeting, we're like, click, we're done, as opposed to we'll sit around at the coffee hour for an hour just chit chatting about the randomest things. But that's what I long for, is those relationships. And I think we as humans long for relationships to be authentic and genuine. And maybe we just haven't gotten the way of figuring out how to do it online yet.
Yeah.
But I think people are just settling for this and saying, I don't want to invest in, it's easier for me to watch First Presbyterian Church as opposed to being a part of it. I think that's what we need to figure out, is how do I be a part of it as opposed to I am consuming live stream that you've done for me.
Right.
And that's great. I don't have to put myself out
Right.
or be a part of the ministry of the First Presbyterian Church. I think that in that whole relationship, that whole authenticity, I think that's something that we need to figure out. I really do think that this live stream and all this stuff is here to stay, but we need to figure out how does it work so that we can be a body of Christ. Because I think that goes back to that relationship. How do we make it work? It can work because I hear stories of my friends. I have a friend that's in in New York, that says we do things online. Our worship and everything is online. But once a month, we gather in New York City, because that's where their church plant is, and we gather for authenticity together. And what is interesting, he'll talk about people that'll drive up from South Carolina to this picnic because they feel they're a part of that church. So they'll make that, I don't even know how long of a drive it is, but I think they figured out how to cross the internet, the web, and actually create authentic relationships. Because if I'm driving from South Carolina
That's
to New York
authentic.
to meet these people for the first time, it's not like we had a previous relationship, but for the first time, they've figured out how to make authentic relationships. I think that's a key, is how do we make authentic relationships online so that you, even though you're in Denver, feel connected with me in Southern California, and we have an authentic relationship across a digital divide. And I think that is not easy for people. It's not easy for me, and it's not easy for pastors, but how do we figure out how to do some of these things? And then on the more permanent side is, how do we as a church acknowledge that we went through a shift? How do we acknowledge it? We're not going to go back. These changes that we've gone through are because crisis accelerates the changes that are already happening. Change was happening,
Right.
but this crisis, COVID, really accelerated it. So instead of a couple of years, we felt like we lived like 10 years, if not 15 years of life. But so we're not going to rewind all these learnings and say these didn't count. But how do churches interact with their communities that are now like vastly different than they were in 2020? And how do we interact with it? And I think that's where we often we as churches and as leaders and assume we know what the community needs, instead of, hey, let's figure out what the community actually needs. And so that's what excites me is how do we live out our faith? As I talked about my spiritual practice, how do we live out our faith into actually doing it, instead of sitting in our four walls and just consuming what's doing? But how do we interact and we live out what God's called us to do?
Yeah, I like that. So you mentioned there about previously about, someone consuming a live stream, being comfortable, and we all understand and can respect and appreciate context where that's appropriate. But you have a quote in the book about, if I can get it right here, something about the church. How often is the church risking its own discomfort rather than asking people to risk their own discomfort? And, the classic kind of way this happens, it's like, come see us on Sunday morning. So a first-time visitor is risking a lot of discomfort walking into the church potentially for the first time. And if I'm understanding correctly, your point is that's not going the other way a lot. So I was really intrigued by that. Talk more about that if you can.
Yeah, so I served as an associate pastor at a church that sends out like 10,000 flyers on Easter, and you open your mailbox and you got flyers from every church,
Right.
and the response rate for that is very low, or
0.075, something crazy.
yeah, and you're like, how many thousands of dollars are you trying to send out to get that one or two people in? But the whole idea of, like, when we think about doing ministries, the story that I often tell is that one of my things I was supposed to do as an associate pastor was figure out how to make interactions with the community. And so what we used to do is do after school Bible studies with kids, help them with their homework and stuff and so forth like that. And I remember walking with the principal of the school and saying, what do you need? I think I know what this community needs, but what do you need? And she goes, 30% of the kids in this neighborhood are on free and assisted lunches. What scares me is what happens this summer when we are no longer around.
Wow.
To do that. And I go, okay, let's be a part of the solution.
Yeah, that's risking some discomfort on your own part.
Yeah, and so I went back to some of the people that make potluck dinners at our church, the ladies that love the macaroni salad, the guys that love to grill and do all these different things, and say, hey, there is a need in our community. What can we do to solve this? And they're like, obviously, we'll cook for everybody in the community. And they're like, we can open up the fellowship hall, people can be air conditioned and everything like that. And I was like, that's where our problem is that we invite everyone to our safe spot. That is not their safe spot. Those in the community, they're like, but we're the church in the community. That's nice that you're the church in the community, but this is where you feel comfortable. And it might take a lot for someone that doesn't know anything about church, or that whatever it might be, to step into our building. We need to go to where the people are.
Yeah.
So I'm like, this is going to be difficult for us, but what we did was we took the church van, we had a trailer on the back, and we put all the meals into the back of the trailer, and we drove it. We literally parked it on the grass of the school in front of them, set up tables and everything, and so that we were where they felt most comfortable, as opposed to where we feel most comfortable. Because there's as I travel around the country, I hear stories about people that get a real physical response of going to church, not knowing how they should act walking into church, let alone during a worship service. Like, if you go in a worship service and you've never been in church before, you're like, okay, they're standing now. Why are they standing now? There's a little asterisk, or the bold's going on. What does the bold mean? or all these different things. But it's like, where we feel comfortable, but for somebody to learn our language, it's uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to be able to go out and to be among people where we might necessarily feel uncomfortable, but where people for the community will be willing to come. The idea is that God, it's this missio Dei, the sending God, that God sent Jesus into the world, who sent the Holy Spirit, who sends us into the world. That if we believe that we are a sent people into the world, why are we making other people take the risks? Why aren't we taking the risk? Sure, I feel I'm a natural introvert, so church planting was incredibly, like, soul sucking in some different ways, just talking to different people. But how do we interact with people that are in the community? We need to believe that God has called us to this community, and so we need to be able to go into this community and to simply be. The verse that I often use comes from Jeremiah 29, where it talks about, in seeking your shalom, in seeking the shalom of the city that I've called you, you will find your shalom.
Yeah.
So that if we're seeking the peace of the city that lives of Los Angeles, or we're seeking the peace of this city, that we will find ours.
Yeah.
And so that we're being called into this community, as opposed to God dumped us into this community and we're trying to figure out what we're supposed to be doing here. But in actuality, that God's called us to this community, and we need to make a difference, because our faith is connected to the shalom of that community, that peace, that whole witness of who we are. Because if in finding the city that God's called us to shalom, we too find our own shalom.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I'm thinking about a while back, I had on JJ Peterson, who's a marketing guy, and he talked about the number one thing that people look for on a church website is what to wear to church. Speaking of discomfort. And then I was laughing about your flyers thing, or mailings. I remember someone telling me that, or actually, I'm thinking back, I think the response rate is like, a good response rate is like 0.5%. So really, to get any kind of like significant bump, someone was telling me, like, for a new church start, you send out 15,000 flyers. So you expect in a good response, 75 people / families. But again, probably looking at 50 cents, if not more, per flyer. So you're talking easily $8,000, which is a lot of money. So no silver bullets there for sure. So I think another thing that you mentioned in the book that I thought was really interesting was you talked about the importance of a church being able to honestly assess their ability to pivot. I think we've all heard the stories of churches being like, oh, if we just get a young pastor in here with a family, everything will be good. Yes. I've experienced that. Talk about, I guess, A, the importance of that honest assessment, and B, what are some like red flags of like, hey, this is not going to work?
Well, on the Cyclical Publishing website that's out there, I've and in my book, and if you want to ask me for it, I'll send it to you for free, is I have a congregational assessment saying, hey, let's look at some of these different things. I'm not saying that no church can't make pivots, but there's some red flags that are out there. Like, if in the inability to follow a mission statement, if your church has an inability to follow a mission statement, then you have some issues that you need to work through.
Yeah.
Or you're saying you have this vision, you have this 10-point plan, you have this plan that if your inability to follow the strategic plan, that if you kind of get 3 steps in and then you get bored and do something else, if some of these different things are happening, then you need to stop. Not saying that you can't do it, but there needs to be a different level of dedication. It's not saying, okay, it's not like you're going and you're going, okay, there's an off ramp here. Let's take the off ramp and let's detour somewhere else. But there's some things that you need to say, hey, if this is where we believe we're going, we need to follow it to the end. But along the way, we need to say we're not going to follow this even if it leads us off the cliff. But you also need to be able to say, hey, we set metrics up and we set evaluative measures, real evaluative measures up there, not necessarily numbers, but what our impact is in the community before we say, okay, this thing isn't working. Because experimentation is important, but also experimentation that's done right is important. Because I think a lot of people are like, we're just going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Because many of the different church fads that are out there, the seeker-sensitive services that were out there, all these different things. If you want to do a MOPS group or whatever, mother preschools or whatever, these different things are out there. Because we've heard stories when pastors get, oh, this worked in my church. Well, then it must work in my church. So what we learned is that context and the people that God has assembled is important. Like if you're trying to lead a mother of preschoolers small group or group in your church, but you have nobody that's in that demographic or even knows how to interact with that, then that obviously is not for you.
Right.
So there needs to be some thoughtfulness to this whole pivot idea. But one of the things that I kind of talk about, kind of alluding to what you said, is that that if only mindset that we have, that if only we had the young hip pastor with ripped jeans, bleached hair, sitting on a stool with as my mother-in-law would say, with the light show going on. But then we could do everything God calls us to do. Or if we had more resources, if we had more families, if we have, the list goes on and on and on of the if onlys. But are we believing that if only God gave us a little more, then we can truly do what God wanted us to do, instead of believing that God's given our church everything that we need? Perhaps we're not using that right. Perhaps that what God's blessed us with, we're using in the wrong different ways. And perhaps we need to reassess how we use our assets was what I really term it, which is not all finances, but it's a physical building, it's partnerships, it's spiritual gifts, it's all these different things. But are we using what God's blessed us with in the way to live out where God calls us to go? And I think a lot of times a lot of our assets go into what we've done previously. That even though no one shows up for it anymore, we still do a lot for a vacation Bible school that does 5 kids, but it takes us months to set up. Or all these different things that we put the assets into the wrong places, as opposed to reorganizing it to what God has possibly wanting us to do. So our ability to pivot is great. There are red flags with it. God calls us to do different things, to seek the shalom in our communities. But how do we pivot, and how do we pivot well, is important. We can't just pivot for the sake of pivoting's sake and leave everyone in our congregation behind. But how do we all move into this way together?
Yeah, that's good. Another interesting point you make in the work towards change is the emphasis on finding the right change leader, I believe is the word you use. And I was curious, is like, what are some key characteristics, key values of such a leader? And this is perhaps part B, more of a cynical question. Like, are there enough leaders in mainline Protestantism to do that work?
And that's a big question.
Yeah.
Is there enough that are willing to do it?
Right.
The definition that I often use for someone that can lead change and lead change well is, you think of a pressure cooker. You think of a pressure cooker that you're cooking, doing different things. Can they keep the pressure on enough without the top blowing off? Because when you're leading in a church, you want to keep the pressure on to make some of these changes, but you don't want to go so far off that you've lost your congregation or you've lost your position or all these different things, because there's so many different intricacies within each church. It's easy to say, yes, we all can make change, but there's intricacies when you lead a church, saying, how do we lead change when we need to make sure that we sustain our stewardship of what's going on? income of what's going on? Are we going to just completely alienate us and everybody is leaving the church? So
Right.
how does the leaders make change? Like some leaders would be saying, okay, I am 4 or 5 years from retirement. Doing change and making change and really making waves is not something I want to do and be left 4 or 5 years out before retirement. So there's all these, so it's not like there's this great list, but it all comes up to us of what we're willing to do. And I think that in the main line, there are enough people that want to do it, but the harder part of it is living it out. How do we keep the pressure on and being willing to keep the pressure on so the top doesn't blow off? Or are we just willing to let it settle and let the pressure cooker be so low that it's not really doing anything?
Yeah.
So it's kind of finding that middle balance, saying, like all pastors will say, we want change. We want God to do incredible things, but I'm not willing to take the risk to do some of these things. Or I'm saying, I'm doing this and I don't care if anyone's following me or not. And suddenly your 500 member congregation is down to 75.
Right.
And all these different things blow up. But I believe there are some, as I get to travel the country, there are some incredible leaders that are doing remarkable things. I love my job. So I work for the Presbyterian Church in the new worshiping communities. And so it's kind of the church planting end of the Presbyterian Church. And just being able to travel around and hear the stories of people that are doing remarkable things. Of these different churches that are like, we are willing to do this because our pastor put the pressure on. And put the pressure on, and oftentimes it got so tight that it wanted to blow off, but he let out the steam enough so that we recognize where we are. And in 5 years, even though it's been hard, we're at somewhere that God is using us in remarkable ways, and we wouldn't want it other ways. So there are incredible things, but it is the willingness of the pastor, the leader, the session, of how much pressure that they're willing to take in their church. Because and it also depends on the church. If they're an older congregation, they're not going to want to have the pressure that they just want to be. They want to come together and worship and do the things that they've been able to do. They don't put any pressure on us to make changes, or suddenly if you're moving from a hymnal to like an electric guitar and during worship or whatever. And there are places for these things that are going on that saying, okay, this congregation won't withstand the pressure, but how does it live out its legacy in the community that God's called them to? Perhaps there needs to be some other way to do it. While they might not be it, maybe something can be created that is going along parallel to them. So there's tons of different options that are out there, and God is using incredible people to do incredible things that I'm excited to be a witness of.
Well, I wish we had more time. I want to ask a bunch more follow-up questions, but for the sake of both of our time, I'll move on here. You write about the importance of investing in resources bearing fruit, and as I interpret it, having some goal metrics. Talk about that, and am I right in my kind of goal metric summation?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things that I've been talking about an awful lot lately. What are we preserving for us? What are we protecting? So like as we're pivoting right now, are we trying to preserve the church exactly like it was pre-pandemic, 1950s, whatever it might be? Or are we trying to say, this is what the ethos of the church is? We want to keep the essentials of the church together and be able to kind of mold and say, but as churches, are you trying to preserve your church? Or are you trying to protect your church? Another question is, going to metrics, is that this is a time of experimentation. People are trying things, which is exciting. They're like, we're going to try this, we're going to try that, we're going to try that. But the hard thing about oftentimes when we say that we're going to try different things, the church doesn't see it as a sprint, but they see it as a marathon. That we're going to do this program and we're going to be doing it until Jesus comes back, or whatever. But we need to say, let's prototype some things. Let's put some things together. Let's say, hey, let's look at it 3 or 6 months down the road. What is the goal of this program? Is this program to reach children, or is it kids? And then we need to say, here is what we want to see happen through this program. And we need to have that sort of mentality instead of saying, this program is going to be cut off if it doesn't have 50 people by the end of it, and they all need to be from the apartment buildings across the street from the church. But we need to have real metrics of what's going on. I think we as churches, we are horrible at metrics of saying this is what our goal is. We're going to do things, and we're just going to go and do things, and we never go back to re-examining if it was successful. I think we need to go back and say, okay, this was successful because it met our goals in the beginning. Our goals were to reach the people in the apartment complex. Our goals was to make a difference in their life, and our goal was to serve them in some way, shape, or form. And we need to go back and say, were those goals met? And then we need to say, if this wasn't the way to do it, what would have been a better way? And perhaps we need to realign to do that. And I think that's what this whole thing, instead of doing something for the sake of doing something. And I think churches do things for the sake of doing something because they've always done it. So like you have these churches that will serve at the food pantry once a month, and God bless them. Yes.
Right.
But what is the point
Right.
of doing that? If you're just investing all your energy to do that, is it a part of the mission of your church? Is this what people are passionate about? Or are you just simply throwing your assets to that direction because that's what you've always done? And is God actually calling you to that? So it's kind of really, really looking at what we're doing and our using of our assets, kind of like what I talked earlier, is like, are we using our assets that God's given us effectively? And perhaps we need to change some of the things we've done to do something that God's called us to do.
Yeah, I'm reminded of, I don't know if you've come across her work. I had on Anna Mitchell Hall, who works for Convergence. I think that's what it's called. Anyway, she mentioned to me that she recommends that churches, they write a eulogy for every new program, which I just love that idea because it just embeds this idea that this is not necessarily a permanent thing. So yeah, those are some great thoughts there. Well, we've got to take a break. The book is, again, Rediscovering Vitality, a handbook for church visioning and missioning. What I liked about it is at the end of every chapter, there was a lot of discussion questions and critical thinking type questions to really get you engaged and thinking about the concepts throughout the chapter. So let's take a quick break. We'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Dr. Reverend Sean Chow, and thanks so much for your time. Enjoy the conversation. So you can take these closing questions as seriously or not as you'd like to, but if you're Pope for a day, what does that day look like for you?
Oh, if I'm Pope for a day, that's a great question. A lot of it goes back to part of my passion is getting people to do things that God's called us to do instead of sitting in our pews. And I think I've kind of really talked about it over this last little bit as we've kind of talked, is that people, if I were Pope for a day, I'd have people do things. Instead of saying, hey, instead of going to church, and I love these churches that have those, we're saying we're closed today, we're doing a service projects in their community instead. And if I were Pope for that would be something vastly important. What if instead of just a church or just a few people, we as a Christian faith decided to make an impact in the United States and throughout the world for just a day? What would that look like if we together served and did what God called us to do instead of simply talk about it?
Yeah, I like that. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Bring back to life. I am fascinated with Phyllis Tickle, who recently died. Martin Luther, and some of these reformers that I see us at the some of these edges of transformational points, pivot points in the church, like the reformers moving from the Catholic Church being the center of it to the Reformation, Protestantism, and then we have what's going on with Martin Luther King and all these different things that are going on in the world now. That I see a lot of comparisons to how do we shake up what Martin Luther did and so forth. So I'd love to spend some time with people. Like, I'd really like to know what gave them all that strength to step against the current of different things. And so, like Phyllis Tickle talks about in her book, that we're in this rummage sale type thing. Every 500 years, everything is shaken up. And I was like, 500 years ago, as the reformers, I was like, okay, they really shook it up. And now we're in this present age where things are being shaken up. like reading the letters from the Birmingham jail, MLK kind of did, and you're just like, whoa, he's talking to me.
Yeah.
I'm like, and just this whole idea of how do we shift in changing, going against the flow of Christianity, saying, hey, this is what the Roman Catholic Church was like, and now we're Protestant. What made them all those different shifts would just blow my mind, as well as some of these people that are doing those exact same thing in today's kind of age of making drastic shifts in what faith looks like to us and how do we live out our faith.
Yeah. Well, what do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
I think history remembers from our kind of current time and place that there's so much division going on that if we look back, because a lot of I do so much reading and we're so much what's going on in the news, and I go, I don't remember all of this, like when we go through history books, like all the civil strife and all this other things that are going on in the world. And I think we're in a time of really defining ourselves. And I think, and my prayer is that this is when we define who we are as a people. And that's what my prayer is that we are so much in so many different places that I'd love for us as Christians, as the Presbyterians or whatever it might be able to identify who and what we are. That we're not just our own individuals, but we're people of faith. And how do we live out people of faith besides just saying this is what we believe, but by what we're doing?
Yeah.
And I would long for this to be a time of revival where the people of God stood up and made a difference in the world. Yeah.
It sounds like that's your hope for the future of Christianity there. Anything else you'd want to add to that?
It is. No, I pray that the church that I grew up in becomes much more diversified. That I would love, that I see it, and we're all in our own little silos as I travel the country. But I'd love for the people of God to come together and to be one voice, even though not technically one voice, but to be one people with many different languages. I'd love for us, and that's my hope, is that we can overcome what it was to be a variety of different denominations and come together and be a people of God, to be able to affect change in this world. Because together we're kind of scattered, or not together we're scattered, but we're scattered, but
right.
Together we can do something amazing. God can do something amazing with all of us together.
Well, I really appreciate your thoughts. Recommend the book to our listeners here. Where can people connect with you online?
People can connect with me through my email, which is sean@rediscoveringvitality.com, or my website, the Aspen Collaborative, or you can find my book and everything else like that on cyclicalpublishing.com/rediscovering-vitality. And so those are the main kind of different channels that you can find me. And so I'm also on Facebook and Instagram and doing a bunch of different things there.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time, and wish you God's peace. May God's peace be with you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.